Why should we attempt to address the adversity that poverty tends to induce? It seems to be intuitive that people are to help the poor, but there has to be a reason for this inclination. Some may believe it was the way that they were raised, or the demand of the God that they worship, but is that ever the core reason? Parents and gods can instill bad teachings if they can instill good ones. We can each find individual reasons for doing what we think is right, through a church or personal philosophy. Yet we want to attempt to find a secular and uniting reason we can all stand behind to make change. Is there something about helping others that is inherently good?
John Rawls, a moral and political philosopher, wrote A Theory of Justice in 1971, in which he discusses the reasons for why we should address poverty-related issues. Generally, his reason is a social contract. He tells us that there is a way we can selfishly be proponent for the poor if we are the poor. Rawls believes that if all people could agree on a societal order, that such a society would be just. Because it is an agreement of all people, a social contract can arguably be altruistic, taking into consideration everyone's needs. Unfortunately, a social contract such as this could never realistically be made because people are biased.
Thus, Rawls's argument begins with a thought experiment. Imagine a group of people behind a veil of ignorance. They have no conception of their own identity. Their socioeconomic status, race, gender, religion, even their conception of the good, or what a person should try to achieve with their life. They are reasonable and unbiased. In this hypothetical situation, Rawls thinks people would come together to agree on a social contract, or a view that persons' moral and/or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live, as defined by the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
While Rawls did not actually put all people behind the veil of ignorance, he did suppose that all people, if reasonable and unbiased, would agree on these four principles. Number 1. Basic liberties for all. This point comes prior to the following ones because it must first and foremost be fulfilled. The basic liberties, once decided upon, can't be changed or cheated out of. However, deciding upon basic liberties is easier said than done. Can we all agree on a set of basic liberties? What are they? And how much is enough in terms of fulfillment? Number 2, the allowance of inequalities. The allowance for inequalities would give people the freedom to choose their lifestyle, as well as economic mobility and incentive. Number 3, inequalities rooted only in fair equality of opportunity. So it wouldn't matter what race, religion, gender you are. In fact, none of these characteristics matter behind the veil. No matter what, you would still have opportunities available, such as jobs and resources. And number 4, a difference principle in which the worst off would be given some advantage for a sufficient lifestyle. This is the Maximum Rule because it seeks to maximize the minimal level of welfare in a society. Basically, Rawls wants to ensure that the least well-off are still as well-off as possible. Of course, this ideal leaves a lot of gray area. What is enough, and would we have to redistribute resources and opportunities in order to reach that level of enoughness?
So those are the ideals Rawls thinks that we would agree upon. But would we really? Rawls believes that everyone behind the veil has the same decision-making characteristics. He claims they are all reasonable, but what exactly is reasonable? One might think it is reasonable for a mother to sacrifice her rights for her child, but Rawls would say no, sacrifice is not a characteristic of a mutually disinterested character. One might think that it is reasonable to be a risk-taker and assume that he or she will have a chance at living a more privileged life. But Rawls also says no. Each person is risk-averse and assumes the worst scenario. With these varieties of decision-making traits, we cannot assume that every person behind the veil would actually agree to his social contract.
Rawls also believes that each person behind the veil is unbiased, which is wonderfully ideal. But let's be realistic. We don't live behind a veil of ignorance. The definition of a social contract stated earlier claims that a social contract is created in and for the society in which they live. Rawls forgets that we don't actually live in a hypothetical world. Not everyone is mutually disinterested or risk-averse, and arguably, most importantly, no one has actually given consent. Rawls assumes that people would give consent, but he never actually asked anyone if they would consent to such a contract. When making decisions and interacting with other people, actual, real consent is necessary. Hypothetical consent can't hold itself up in a real-world scenario where push comes to shove.
Meet Joe, a wealthy and powerful man. He wouldn't have what he has today if he lived in a world where Rawls's just theory had been consented upon while behind the veil. However, Joe never actually consented. Hypothetical consent is not actual consent. Can Joe be forced to give up some of his resources because Rawls assumed that in an ideal theory, Joe would? Can justice exist in the system without consent? Would this lack of consent violate Rawls's first condition of basic liberties? It is hard to say when we have yet to define such liberties. Where would these resources be redistributed? Is the redistribution more important than his liberties?
Robert Nozick is known as an influential critic of Rawls. He dedicates a lot of his argument for distributive justice to claiming that redistribution is an injustice. Any system behind the veil that would take one's earnings and possessions to give to another without their consent is unjust, regardless of any Robin Hood intentions. Essentially, he's ruling out Rawls's third societal condition, that there be fair equality of opportunity for all. He makes some good points. Would doing this be possible without violating basic liberties, which is Rawls' first priority in his social contract?
Nozick proposes his own society through what he calls the entitlement theory. He defines justice differently than Rawls, emphasizing that justice on an action rather than its outcome. Through 1, just acquisitions, 2, just transfers, and 3, just rectification, a just society can be reached. Through this, the only way one can attain something is through actual consent, as opposed to Rawls' hypothetical consent of a reasonably mutually disinterested person behind the veil. Nozick provides a much simpler maxim: to each as they choose, from each as they are chosen.
Joan goes to the store, and she sees a holding she'd like to acquire. To do this, she and Joe form an agreement that in exchange for the loaf of bread, she will give him money, making this transaction a just one. Now let's look at a transfer that would violate Nozick's principle of just holdings. Joan has acquired her loaf of bread through a just transfer. Jeff is very hungry, but he does not have the money to pay Joan, and Joan does not want to give the bread to him for free. In Rawls's world, maybe someone would take a slice of Joan's bread in order to feed Jeff, but there is no such provision here. Thus, Jeff takes the loaf without Joan's consent. For this violation, there is to be just rectification. Jeff, in this society, would be forced to rectify his action. He would return the loaf of bread and compensate for Joan's loss.
Oversimplified scenarios such as these make the entitlement theory sound very appealing. The more complicated it gets, though, the more difficult such a maxim becomes. Consider something as commonplace and expected as clean water. Martha works out a just transfer where she pays the city money, who in turn provides her with clean water. Mark's family cannot afford this fee, so he goes without this necessity, as no one chooses to give it to him for free. While Mark may not survive without water, Nozick would say this is the unfortunate product of a just society. But what if Martha has gained her wealth and ability to afford water because, generations back, her family had exploited Mark's and ruined his chance at success?
Nozick would respond that this injustice ought to be rectified, but at a certain point, this just rectification sounds a lot like the redistribution that Rawls supports. Maybe they can be interpreted in such a way that they're not at odds. Seeing that seemingly conflicting viewpoints could actually find the same conclusion, we feel that redistribution is inevitable and necessary for a just society, whether justice is in the act or justice is in the outcome. While Rawls is concerned with the just outcome, Nozick focuses on a just process. If we engage both philosophies, the ends don't need to justify the means when the means are just and moral as well. When deciding what justice is and should be, we don't need to compromise one for the other, and we can hold our ideal society to a higher standard.
Now the question is, how can that be? Rawls and Nozick seem unrealistic on their own. The way we see it, Nozick and Rawls can serve as checks and balances for one another. The society Rawls suggests from his social contract can serve as a framework of what to strive for. At the same time, the entitlement theory can ensure that in the building of such a society, we stay true to liberties and just actions. For instance, if in setting some provision for the worst off in society, we unjustly take from other resources that might not have been given with consent, liberties are being violated. This is not the way we ought to redistribute with justice in mind.
But what if we could make the worst off as well off as possible without basic liberties of the more privileged being violated? Charitable organizations and institutions could volunteer or donate willingly. Individuals could consciously redistribute their wealth willingly. Or we could agree that certain actions require a just rectification. If all persons involved agree that a certain action requires a just rectification, then redistribution may be the means in which they make things right. Redistribution can be done with justice in mind. when you take into account both of the ideals of Nozick and Rawls. Their conceptions, if combined, could be a strong secular reason, hopefully agreed upon by all, for why just redistribution is possible in order to fulfill and maintain all basic liberties.